All right, everyone, we're going to switch over into these post-processing for Frank Gehry. So I'm going to go ahead and open that file that we just exported from Rhino. And before I do anything, we notice that our line work is looking pretty good in here. I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer called render underlay and drag it to the bottom of the workspace and do a file place and then place that render that we just did. So I'm going to make sure that up here, my width for the object is like 20 inches. You can kind of pick. Basically, if it's between like 12 and 24 inches, it's cool with us. And you're going to note that the height is 10.3173. You also want to make sure that this button is checked because obviously if I type in like 40 here, it's going to stretch it only in one way. Whereas if it's pushed down, it's going to do it in the both directions. So we're going to make this 20. I'm going to copy this 10.3173 value. And I'm actually going to click off of that and click Document Setup, hit Edit Artboards, and make that my height, and make sure that the width here is 20 inches. And that's going to make it the exact size of the PNG. So if I do Edit Copy, and then delete this and hit Control-0, that's going to center the artboard on my screen, at which point I can just hit Edit Paste or Control-V, and it'll perfectly center it on this. I'm going to go ahead and make the opacity of this thing like, I don't know, 50% for now, and lock that layer. And now what I can do is line up all of this line work with the render underlay. So please actually take the time to really line this stuff up. This is a final drawing and it should look crisp and it should look pretty much perfect as far as alignment's concerned. So you'll see that this corner point right here is the furthest left point on the selection, which is indicated by this bounding box. And I want it to be aligned with this point exactly. So if I do something like that, it looks pretty good. You'll see that it starts to get kind of wonky over here, like this stuff isn't aligned anymore. And the way to fix that is to note where the furthest right point is, which is right here, and simply holding Shift while dragging to scale it proportionally to that edge. And then I'll zoom in and align that perfectly. And now when I go back to my bottom left corner, that should still be perfectly aligned, which it is. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything and make it black. By making sure the RGB code is 000. I'm going to make it like 0.5 line weight perhaps, just so it's a little bit thinner. And you'll remember that we did a poche in Rhino. And that's going to be on this layer right here, which I'm going to drag to the top because the poche should always be the top layer. And you'll notice that if I lock all of the layers except for that poche, I can simply select them and I can... Hold on a sec. Floor outline. Do we actually want to select the intersections layer? We do. We actually want to do the intersections layer. Sorry about that. We want to make sure that that one's on the top and lock everything except for that. And if I do what's called live paint, basically I can select all of those objects and do Object Live Paint Make or Control Alt X. And you'll notice that if I flip the stroke and the fill using this arrow, it'll fill in everything that can be filled in. So instead of having just these outlines, we can actually fill it in. If flipping this arrow doesn't work, what we can do is go to the Shape Builder tool and go to the Live Paint bucket, or just hit K on our keyboard. And if we change the fill color like this, we can basically just click anywhere within that live painting that we just made and make it a different color. So that's an alternate option. I'm going to go ahead and just have the intersections tab on to make sure that the poche looks good, and it does. I'm going to turn on just the floor outline to make sure everything looks good. There's a couple of kind of weird lines going on right here that I'm going to delete because they were intersecting each other. Actually, we're going to go ahead and do it like this. Just delete those two because it'd be nice to have the remaining line work. I don't really know what happened here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And just kind of run around the perimeter of this thing and make sure that everything looks good. And I think for the most part that it does. So we're going to go ahead and turn all of our other layers back on. And I think we're batting pretty well. Frank Gehry doesn't use a lot of shadow in his renders, but I think it's nice to get a sense of space in such a complex form. So what I'm going to do now is turn off my panels layers and my intersections layers so that I just have kind of this floor plate and these textures going on. So if I select my textures lines and make them, we'll leave them like this for now. But basically we want to make sure that we're able to fill in this entire thing. And the way that I'm going to do that is by first I want to select everything on the floor outline layer and do edit, copy, edit, paste in place. And what that's going to do is make a duplicate copy on top of, exactly on top of where it was, because it's line work and it's measurable and calculable. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to the textures layer and hide the floor outline. And now we should be left with something that we can make a live paint from. You can see that there's a gap right here and right here. So what I'm actually going to do is also make a copy of that intersections poche. Is that going to make a difference? I don't think it is. We're actually going to turn off our render underlay, and we're going to go ahead and extend these lines manually. And you'll see why in a moment. Basically, if I click on one of these lines and make sure that it is ballpark touching the corner of something like this and this and this. Oh, by the way, if you hold down Control and then use your scroll wheel, you can pan to the left and the right, which is how I'm doing that so quickly. It's a good way to stay zoomed in without having to zoom in and out really quick, which you can do by hitting Control minus and Control plus. So I'm going to extend these down to there. I'm going to extend this down to here. Basically, I just want to make sure that when I go to fill this in, it has a solid boundary running around the entire thing. And I think the rest of this drawing is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is select all of this and do another live paint by going to Object, Live Paint, Make. And you'll notice that if I go back to my paint bucket tool or hit K, that each of these red zones is going to be able to be filled in individually. So going back to this texture conversation, I'm going to go ahead and go to Window, Swatches, and that should bring up this menu. And I'm going to go down to the Swatch Libraries menu and basically pick out, I don't know, let's just say Patterns, Basic Graphics, Textures. And let's see what that brings up. That's going to bring up a bunch of black and white stuff, which I think is wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and click on one of these, like the capsules, and making sure that we have the live paint bucket selected, or K. We can just click on one of those regions and it'll fill it in. That actually looks like garbage, so we're not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of go down the line and see a bunch of different textures that I like. So that one looks fine. That one looks fine. I think that one's good. That's kind of weird, actually. We're going to do that. We're going to do this. Don't care much for that. Basically, you're just going to do this process until you fill in the entire drawing. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through this for a couple of seconds while I do that. Okay, so I think this works fine. Once I have all of this done, what I'm going to do is, because this is a live paint object, it's basically a group. So if I hit delete, it's going to delete the whole thing. But basically, I want to make sure that the line stroke is none, so that you don't see those division lines between everything. And now when I go to turn back all of my other layers, of course, those will still be there. Maybe we do want a little bit of a line weight. You can kind of do this based on how you want this thing to look. I'm going to make mine like a light gray and then do like a 0.5 font. We'll see how that looks. I think that's pretty nice, actually. So overall, I think that it's getting into the territory of Frank Gehry stuff, and certainly you guys can add or diminish as much as you'd like. I think one last thing that I want to do is show you guys about how to automatically update files. So you'll notice that it's kind of hard to differentiate this one and this type of panel and this type of panel and this type. So if I go back into my Rhino file, I'm going to go to my perspective view. I'm actually going to have to undo some of this stuff because I kind of messed it up at the end of the last tutorial. We just need to make sure that it's not bent anymore, basically. Well, maybe we're not going to be able to. Basically, what I was going to say is if you make this a different color by going to Properties, Material, and then change it to like use a new material and custom, I can make it like a darker gray, so something like this. And you'll notice that once we go to the rendered view, it will make it, oops, sorry, not the gloss portion, my bad. You're gonna go to color and then make it like a darker gray. Something like this. You notice that it changes the color. All you have to do is re-render it. And if you hit save and make it a PNG, basically once you go back to an Illustrator, it's gonna say some of these files have been updated. Would you like to update them? And you'll hit yes. So for example, if I wanna switch this out really quick, I'll hit the render underlay, go to links, and if I hit this button right here that says relink, and I make it, let's say, this image, you're going to notice that it changes that background image. So it's a really good way to say, you know, if I did want to open this up in Photoshop and do some editing, let's go ahead and just rotate it really quick just to prove a point. Once I go back in here, it's going to say some files are missing or modified. You just hit yes, and it should automatically update for you. So it's a really good way to make the Adobe suite talk to each other. And I think that I think the only thing that maybe we can do to this drawing is start to play around with some of these overhangs. So these panels are actually above these textures, and we want it to probably show that way. So what we can do is go to our layers and basically select everything except for our textures. And we can select all of this and hold on a sec. We need to make sure all these panels are unlocked. Basically, we want to do object, live paint, make. There's probably going to be a couple of things that pop up that say like complex appearances, something or other. Just go ahead and hit OK or continue through all those. This part's really important, so pay attention. Hit edit, copy, edit, undo, merge live paint, so that everything's still on its original layer. I'm going to make a new layer and hit edit, paste in place. So now we still have everything that has its own layer, but we also have a version that we can just click as an entire group. So what we can do with this basically is put the textures on the very bottom layer, and then we're going to go ahead and put this guy on the layer right above that. And basically take our live paint bucket tool, and I like to start out with like a really kind of bright color like red, and just spam click it until everything fills in, and go back to my none fill and make sure that basically this kind of floor plate is not filled in, or it is transparent. So I think that's all we need to do for that. And it may be best to change this back to white because it looks like garbage right now. So if I go to my fill color and make it solid white, and again spam click it, I should be able to go back and show everything. And now you can see that those panels are now above the textures, but they still have the shadows on them because the render underlay is operating at 50%. So one last thing we could do if we wanted to basically make this a floor plate a different color, we can actually go back to our textures layer, make sure it's unlocked, and we can go ahead and do edit, copy, edit, paste in place again, put it on a new layer, and let's say it's just called solid fill. And what we can do from here is basically go to our live paint bucket, and let's make it like 200, 200, 200. Whoops, I did 2000. That's not what I was looking for, Chief. And if I just spam click all of this stuff, because they're different textures, it's not going to work until I get to kind of these outer ones like this. Basically, if I select this and turn off all of the line work on that, we're going to notice that it is a solid color that we can basically adjust on the bottom layer. So I actually want this underlay to be maybe a little bit darker, not much. But if I double click on my fill, and let's make it like 150, 150, 150, we still have some of those textures, and this is starting to differentiate itself a little bit more than the exterior. And that's something that you all can play with, and you should play with, but this should be a pretty simple way of post-processing some of this Frank Gehry stuff in Illustrator afterwards. So if you have any questions, let me know. But until next time, keep working hard on this stuff, and you can come to class on Wednesday with any questions that you may have.